All right. So before I begin, as it were, the historical part, that is what was happening in India in the 16th century and the coming of the Europeans, what I want to do is I want to take about 10-15 minutes to wrap up my discussion of Orientalism and just reiterate a few points that I had made in my previous class. So when we had been discussing Orientalism, I had pointed out to you that Orientalism is not simply a set of prejudices that the Western intellectuals, writers, and others had about something called the Orient. The Orient, of course, itself is a term that has many implications and significations. For example, just to give you a little illustration, in the United States, what is called Asian American Studies, until about really 2 decades ago, didn't really include South Asian Americans. Asian American here principally meant Japanese American, Chinese American, Korean American, Filipino American, and so on. In Britain, the word Asian refers principally to South Asians, by contrast. And when I say South Asians, I mean, of course, Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis. And of course, there is the Near Orient, there's the Far Orient. But we don't need to be detained by those considerations, right? What's the difference between China and India and Japan and so on and so forth, and even the Middle East? The principal point here simply is that this thing called the Orient, that Orientalism was a intellectual mechanism, if you want to put it this way, a whole intellectual apparatus by which the West or the Occident sought to understand something called the Orient, right? So it's obviously based, Orientalism is based on a distinction between an epistemological and ontological distinction between the Occident and the Orient. Said goes on to argue, and many others who have followed in his wake have argued, taking his point there almost as an axiom, namely that the Orient was in some ways a European invention. That European writings on India, to be specific, since we're talking about India, may not really tell you very much about India, certainly in the 18th century and 19th century, but they do tell you a lot about the intellectual milieu, right, from which the European writers and intellectuals came, the European thinkers came. There's another way of, I want to introduce just a different framework for understanding this. Namely, it has been argued that there is a specific relationship between colonialism and Orientalism. This specific relationship comes into place in the 18th century, right? In the 18th century, when colonialism becomes a major force. And this will help us understand why the 18th century is important, because if you simply thought of Orientalism as a set of prejudices, then, as I argued in my previous class, we can take a whole range of writers before the 18th century, such as Dante, for example, or Herodotus, and many others, and we can say that, well, they had whole sets of prejudices as well. So it's not a question of prejudices. Why Orientalism becomes important in the 18th century has to do, of course, with the fact that that is when colonialism now becomes a worldwide phenomenon, right? It becomes a worldwide phenomenon, and therefore it is important to understand that Orientalism was not simply a rationalization or justification of colonial rule. It was, in fact, its precondition. Okay, you needed. So on the one hand, you need Orientalism because it does the intellectual work of colonialism, but in many ways we can also argue that in fact colonialism was precipitated by Orientalism. It's both the cause and the effect, if I had to use a layman's language, all right? It's both. And this is where I think we want to try to understand what is a particularly 18th century connotations of this whole thing, that in the 18th century, unlike in previous centuries, certain ideas come to have an explanatory power which they did not have before. Okay? They come to have an explanatory power. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that very simply is that there were always times when people had certain views about the Orient. So Dante had certain views. A 15th century European explorer might have had certain views. He might have thought, oh, these people are superstitious, they're barbarians, so forth and so on. But these were, if I may put it this way, the prejudices now of particular individuals. In the 18th century, what changes is that certain conceptions of the Orient now become part of the worldview of Europeans, right? That is what I mean when I say they have an explanatory power, that it was by the 18th century it was understood that this is the nature of the Orient, and you don't really need to think any differently about it. It's not a matter of an individual having this or that prejudice. It is now a set of ideas which have an extraordinary explanatory power. These ideas begin to be put into place by the 18th century, especially the second half of the 18th century, when colonialism now begins to become a major force. Of course, the age of European exploration and expansion started much earlier, as we'll see in just a few minutes when I turn my attention to what's happening in India circa 1500, moving into the 1600s. I think there was somebody there had raised their hand. Yeah.
I was just going to ask that in the 18th century, are you saying that it became part of like scholarship, like mass distributed scholarship, rather than...
In part, yes. Yeah, because before you didn't really have what you would call a certain kind of scholarship, right? These histories of India that are going to be written, for example, in the 18th century. And when we turn to the middle of the term, we're going to look at this whole question of what was the intellectual project of colonialism in much greater detail. Well, I'll show you actually a PowerPoint, and you'll see, a list of 100 books that are written, right? See, before it was sporadic. It was, some individuals' whims dictate what they think about, if I may put it this way, the Orient. By the 18th century, what we are saying is that this is now a worldview. It is not simply the matter of what a certain individual thinks anymore about the Orient. Okay? That's a fundamental change that we're really speaking about. Now, just turning my attention to Ron Inden's piece, which I had started discussing in my last lecture, but I want to look at it in some greater detail just for a few minutes. So he says two of the assumptions built into the episteme of Indology. Episteme means the intellectual framework. Okay? Are that the real world consists of essences and that the world is unitary. The world is unitary. All right? It is also similarly, it is also supposed that at a lower level, each culture or civilization embodies a similarly unitary essence. I'm going to read this through and then I'll explain it to you. Since the unitary essence of human nature is assumed to be most fully realized in the West. Think about that for a moment, okay? Since the unitary essence of human nature is assumed to be most fully realized in the West, a major difficulty, if not the fundamental one, that has confronted the scholar of non-Western others, such as Indians or Arabs, has been how to reconcile the essence of the other's civilization with the European-American manifestation of human nature's unitary essence, rational scientific thought and the institutions of liberal capitalism and democracy. Let me paraphrase this. What Inden is saying is that there is a fundamental intellectual problem that we all have to think about when we're looking at this whole body of work produced in the 18th century down to the present day. That fundamental problem is the following. That at the heart of European thought, especially what is called Enlightenment thought, the Enlightenment of the 18th century, is the idea that human civilization is one. That we have a unitary history. That whatever the differences amongst us all, in some ways, we all are destined to have the same end. We are all destined to be, in principle, free human beings, embodying certain conceptions of liberalism or democracy. In the 20th century, we would add the phrase human rights. No one talked about human rights in the 18th century, of course, right? But the idea is that human nature is unitary. It's one. It's just that the more advanced aspects of that are to be found in the West. Right? So this is one impulse. However, there is a fundamental contradiction at the source. That contradiction is the other impulse was that in fact there is an extraordinary difference between us and the other. Right? There is an extraordinary difference. And we can then look at the essence of Indian civilization and say that in some sense this essence of Indian civilization, right, is very different than the essences that describe the West. That the impulse to be free is something peculiarly Western. Right? So as George Orwell would say in one of his essays, you know, that freedom is like the air that the Englishman breathes. Right? He cannot think of himself except as a free person, unlike in the Orient where no one thinks of freedom. Right? Servitude is a normal human condition in the Orient. Right? If you take somebody like John Stuart Mill, I mean, some of you may be remotely familiar with him, the great theorist of liberty, right? He writes an essay on liberty, one of the classics of Western European political thought, 19th century. But what is the contradiction for Mill? That Mill, of course, is the classic example of a liberal who suggests that, well, human history is one, we all aspire to freedom, liberty, so forth and so on, and yet what he argues is that there are people out there in that part of the world, whether it's India or the Arab world, who frankly do not have the maturity to be free. Right? We have to represent them. They cannot represent themselves. Right? This is the fundamental source of the contradiction that bedevils European thought beginning in the 18th century. Right? That is what Ronald Inden is saying, that we're going to have to be really aware of this. A major difficulty that has confronted the scholar of non-Western others has been to how to reconcile the essence of the other civilization, okay, with the Euro-American manifestation of human nature's unitary essence. That in the Euro-American world, the idea is that the individual is an embodiment of rational thought, scientific thought, right? And that this rational scientific thought gives rise to certain institutions and certain practices associated with liberal democracies and capitalism. Right? So this is what Ronald Inden is going to seek to do. And in the pages of this article itself, he's going to look at this argument he's going to put forward this argument, of course, in much greater detail. We don't have the luxury here of going through all of it, but I want to put into place simply what he has said about this. I'll turn to you in just a minute, Lorenzo. Let me just finish one last thought, and then I'll take any questions that you might have about it. I want to look at the one illustration that he gives, which is an interesting illustration that I don't entirely agree with his reading of it, but I want to just look at it very briefly. So on page 408 of the article, he has a subsection called Orientalist Discourse. Okay, he says the knowledge of the Orientalists is therefore privileged in relation to that of the Orientals, and it invariably places itself in a relationship of intellectual dominance over that of the Easterners, right? So the knowledge that the European scholar, the Orientalist, has, right, is privileged in relationship to the knowledge that the Orientals have of themselves. Right? In fact, the European knows the Indian better than the Indian knows himself or herself. Right? Now, he says, and this is the illustration that he's going to take, he says, take the idea of non-violence. And you know, and we're going to get to this in week 10 in case you don't know, that of course the chief architect of the Indian independence movement was Mahatma Gandhi, right? Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And he's not simply the architect of the Indian independence movement, he is the principal theorist and practitioner of the idea of non-violence in the 20th century. Right? Now, it is Ronald Inden's submission that one of the reasons why Gandhi took up this idea of non-violence was because, in fact, the European thinkers had highlighted the fact that the Indians tended to be superstitious about such things as nonviolence. Right? In other words, so here's a quotation here. He's quoting James Mill, who's a 19th century European writer. James Mill is the father of someone whose name I mentioned to you a few minutes ago. He's the father of John Stuart Mill. Okay? And James Mill writes this huge work called History of British India in 6 volumes in the 1820s. Mill says, I have not enumerated the religion of the Hindus as one among the causes of gentleness which has been remarked in their deportment. So he says they are very gentle people. But Mill is exceedingly critical, as you'll see. This religion has produced a practice which has strongly engaged the curiosity of Europeans, a superstitious care of the life of the inferior animals. You know, the Hindu is so prone to non-violence, he's so superstitious that he won't even kill a cockroach or an insect. Right? Right? This is what he's saying. Okay? A Hindu lives in perpetual terror of killing even an insect. You can spend a lot of time trying to parse this. Right? And hardly any crime can equal that of being unintentionally the cause of death to any animal of the more sacred species. Right? So he sees this, you know, that the Hindu is superstitious for various reasons, and it has to do with the nature of religion. You can't really kill any living being. And this is, of course, the reason why Indians have taken to nonviolence, not from some higher ethical principle, but simply because they live in terror of killing a living being. And you might think to yourself from the vantage point of 2017, well, maybe we should all live with that kind of terror. Maybe if we all lived with that kind of terror, the world might be a lot better place. You know, right? Okay, but you see, for him, this is like the Indian is this sheer embodiment of superstition and irrationality. And what Ronald Inden, by the way, is going to argue there, that, you know, that it is possible to argue that, in fact, one of the reasons why Gandhi picked up on this whole idea of nonviolence, of course, you know, I'm not looking at all the writings of the 19th century which are going to veer in that direction, but he argues that in some ways Gandhi was basically embodying Orientalist thinking. And, you know, this is not the time and place to dispute that particular reading. But I'm giving this illustration because it gives you a very good sense of some of the complexities involved in trying to unravel what we call Orientalist discourse. So that is the phrase that you should think about, that there is a kind of Orientalist discourse about India. There are certain assumptions in that discourse, certain assumptions about the other, about that part of the world. Right? And there's a certain kind of language in which this Orientalist discourse is going to be written. So that's what we're going to see when we move along in the course over the next several weeks. Yes, question now.
I mean, you've said here that these are two separate ideas. On the one hand, you sort of have the Enlightenment Project, history is unitary, and different levels of development, but ultimately we're all the same, we're going to the same place.
Yeah.
Then there's this other sort of idea, which is again is also very old, there's a fundamental difference between us and them.
That's right.
But are you arguing in the European mind these two sort of coexist together, or are they separate ideas adopted by different people?
Well, that is going to obviously in some ways, vary from individual to individual, right? You could answer it at that level. But at the intellectual level, yes, they coexist. There is this fundamental impulse, as I've said, that you're going to find in some European thinkers to argue that, look, there is some kind of unitary history of humankind that we can write. Okay? Because, of course, you have to ask yourself this. Why is there an Enlightenment Project which says that we have to map out everything in the world? Why is it so important for us Europeans to know what the flora and the fauna of India and China and the Arab world is? Right? Are we going to say that it's simply intellectual curiosity? Right? And by the way, there are thinkers today who have argued that one of the things that distinguishes the West from other parts of the world is that there is a certain kind of intellectual curiosity which is intrinsic to Western intellectual traditions. Right? People have argued that. I don't find that a very persuasive argument, but that has been very much put forward as an argument, right? By someone like, for example, Samuel Huntington, the late Samuel Huntington, Harvard professor, right? That there is a kind of intellectual curiosity. But no, I think it has to do with the fact that there was at the heart of the Enlightenment Project this idea that we can know everything out there, we can map it, we can have, there is this huge body of objective knowledge that we can create about the world, and that it is desirable to do so. Right? But on the other hand, I'm suggesting to you that colonialism itself and the intellectual work of colonialism, namely Orientalism, was itself predicated on the assumption that there is a sharp epistemological and ontological break between something called the Occident and something called the Orient. And in the same writer, you might very often find a contradiction. You might. But certainly, if you're looking at European thought as a whole, we can say that this contradiction is going to be embodied in different aspects of Western thought. Yes?
I have a question to the previous point you made.
Yeah.
That by the 18th century, Orientalism became a worldview.
Yeah.
So would you say that Orientalism as an intellectual apparatus existed before the 18th century, or no?
Would I say that the intellectual apparatus is a worldview?
No, I'm saying that before the 18th century,
Yeah.
Like you said, we had sporadic ideas about...
Yeah, sure.
So did Orientalism exist as an intellectual apparatus before the 18th century, or would we
No,
say that?
no. It comes into place in the 18th century. That's what we're saying. That there is a specific relationship between Orientalism and colonialism. This relationship comes about in the 18th century. Right? There might have been people who had Orientalist ideas, but that systematic relationship between the two does not come into place. And another way of talking about the systematic relationship is to call it a worldview. Yet another language is, it's an intellectual apparatus. Right? And this intellectual apparatus will include things like histories, surveys, all kinds of things. Yeah. Which we'll get a better sense of when we move into this in the middle of the course. Yeah.
If this assumption that this thirst of freedom is peculiarly Western,
Yeah.
I guess, essence, and that servitude is a normal condition of the Orient.
Of the Orient.
Then how do we look at efforts to decolonize or efforts, striving against colonialism, and is that itself a product of a colonized mind to strive for this freedom?
Yeah, look, the question is a very complex one. It's a complex one. I don't mean only the question you're posing, but the questions behind this, right? Because in some sense, what we have to try to understand is what is the nature of colonization, okay? What is the nature of colonization? So if we're saying that there is this contradiction in the 18th century, which continues down to the present day. If you look at contemporary European, Euro-American discourse on, let's say, the Arab world, right? You see exactly the same features. On the one hand, there are people in the State Department who will say that, well, we have a moral obligation to bring democracy to these parts of the world. Now, why do we have a moral obligation? We have a moral obligation because democracy is the teleological end. It is the desirable end, the apotheosis of human civilization. And everyone should share in that apotheosis of human civilization. Right? Everyone should share in that. On the other hand, there's a strand of thought which says that, well, this civilization is fundamentally different from ours. It's fundamentally different from ours. Now the question is, how is this going to be negotiated? How is this contradiction going to be negotiated? And of course, there are multiple ways in which it may be negotiated, depending on the worldview of those who are attempting to negotiate it, as well as the worldview of those who are at the receiving end of this negotiation. Right? So what does nationalism mean? Right? Isn't it the case, let's go to the heart of your question in a sense. Isn't it the case that the nationalists are going to deploy the language of the colonizer to seek their own freedom? So if a nationalist says, I want freedom and I want democracy and I want liberty, is that person simply echoing Western thought, or is that person actually echoing something which simply happens to be the case that the West is a better embodiment of that thought? It's not that it is intrinsically Western, but the West at this stage of history embodies that thought better than other parts of the world. Right? So these questions are questions that would have to be understood by trying to place what these thinkers are doing in the 18th century, 19th century down to the present day. We would have to place it along a spectrum. Okay? We would have to place it along a spectrum and then see what are the particular ways in which they actually attempt to negotiate this fundamental problem, which is a problem for all people who are looking at the nature of intellectual work. Right? But this intellectual work has, of course, political implications. It has political implications all the time. I mean, the most overt implications have to do, obviously, with such things as nationalism, right? But it has to do with a great many other things. The languages that we use to understand each other, right? Because remember, behind Orientalism, behind all of this, there is that fundamental question. Behind Inden, there is that fundamental question. That fundamental question is, how does one civilization attempt to enter into a conversation with another civilization without doing that civilization some kind of injustice? You can use the word culture. Civilization is a very lofty word. How should Americans talk about the rest of the world without doing that world an injustice? How should others talk about the United States without doing it injustice? Right? If our idea of the United States was reduced to a caricature, because if we took the example of the president-elect and said, well, that tells you that's the essence of the United States, the language that he speaks. Now, somebody might say, well, that's a caricature. But there would obviously be a caricature the other way around too if we simply said that, well, you know, this is what Afghan men do to their women. And therefore, this tells us something about the nature of Afghan civilization. Right? So I think these are the questions that we're going to have to... I can't take any more questions right now because we won't really get to the next segment of the course. Okay? All right, so but these are the broad parameters that I think you all have to keep in mind when we start to look at the history of British India. Now, let us turn to something very different. All right? So before the British came to India, what was going on in India? The British arrive in India in 1600. We'll see the circumstances under which they arrive in India. But before the British came to India, there were the Portuguese. The Portuguese had come to India. And of course, we have to ask, so here is you can see, by the way, this is Hindustan. Look at this map here, it says Hindustan, doesn't say India. Remember, I started by the course by saying there are different names by which the country is known. And here you have India here at the bottom. They put the same thing. And here you can see this is India is basically here. This is a peninsula. And then, of course, the portion here, which you're not seeing, that's a Himalayan range. You'll see other maps as well. But the reason I'm giving you this map here is I want you to first think about India and Southeast Asia. That you have to keep in mind. This is a subject for a whole course unto itself. That there is something called the Indian Ocean trading world. Okay, for those of you who read literature, I will do this throughout the course. I'm going to mention names. If you ever get interested, you can pick it up. But there's a extremely well-known, acclaimed writer today, Amitav Ghosh, who has written a trilogy. It's kind of what you might call the Opium Trilogy, the Ibis Trilogy. It's called. And basically, it's about India and its relations with China and the Opium Wars, which we're going to look at much later on in the 19th century. But here, if you look, you see this is Southeast Asia over here. Okay, Siam is Thailand, right? And this is Indonesia here. Now, one of the things that the Portuguese had come to Southeast Asia for was for spices. Okay, spices, right? And also called the Spice Islands. And India, this is the western coast. This coast is sometimes known here as the Malabar coast. And here, this is known as the Coromandel coast very often. This part of India, basically, if I had just had to draw a line, let's say you had a horizontal line, everything below here, this is called the Deccan. The Deccan. Okay, so you'll see this word, very often. All right. Now the Portuguese had come to India. Let me just take you to another slide over here. So one of the reasons why the Portuguese were interested, this history goes back to the mid-15th century. If you want more detail, by the way, I do a class called History of India, Broad 3, but those lectures are all on YouTube, all of them. And so you can go to the appropriate lecture, they're tagged, and you'll get much greater detail of what's really happening here. Now, here is Lisbon, right? That's Portugal. That's Portugal. And the whole idea was that typically, what would you do before Vasco da Gama is going to round the Cape of Good Hope? This is the Cape of Good Hope, and he's going to find a sea route to India over here. This is the sea route to India. Before this sea route was discovered, how would the Portuguese have gone to Southeast Asia? They would have gone over here, okay, through what you would now today call the Middle East, and then come over here. Okay, and move further down to Southeast Asia over here. Malacca, Sumatra, that's what you saw in the previous slide. That's Southeast Asia over here. Now, there was one problem. One problem was that if you went through these parts, you would have to pay very heavy duties. You'd have to pay very heavy duties because the Ottomans are controlling that part. All right? And so what the Portuguese wanted to do was they wanted to find a way whereby they could actually trade with Asia, Southeast Asia, without having to pay these duties to the middlemen, and without the stranglehold of Islam over them. I'm putting those are the terms that you should be really thinking about, because it's not simply an economic matter here. We know that there is a rivalry, if I may put it this way, between Christianity and Islam. These are the two proselytizing faiths. All right. So what you have to think about here is that when this sea route is going to be discovered over here, so Vasco da Gama is, by the way, he's going to arrive here on the west coast in Calicut in sometime around May 1498, sometime around that point. Okay, and the Portuguese are going to establish themselves on the west coast. They're going to become a major trading power. It's mainly a coastal power. I want to just show you this particular slide over here. So if you look at European settlements in India, and if you look at the key over here, so you can see that there are 5 countries that we're talking about here: Portugal, England, France, Holland, and Denmark. And the key tells you exactly when these places were. So the west coast over here, so you see Calicut here, 1498. This is where the Portuguese are going to first establish themselves. And then they're going to have an establishment over here and down in Cochin, all within the space of a few years. But if you look at this map, you're going to see that not just the Portuguese, but all the other European powers are basically going to have a coastal presence. They don't really have any presence inland. Okay? They don't have any presence inland. That's the key thing that you should really be taking note of. I should also say, by the way, and we're not going to spend much time on the Portuguese, but from approximately around here until here, the Portuguese is going to become almost the lingua franca of that part of India. It is going to become the language in which people are going to trade. It's going to become the dominant spoken language in many ways in that portion of coastal India. Okay, and And this is not the time and place to do an assessment of Portuguese rule in India. But I can tell you this, that there are historians. A good example of that would be someone whom you're reading for this week, K.M. Panikkar. You're reading a short excerpt from his book, Asia and Western Dominance. And Panikkar took the view, he wrote another book, by the way, which is a book entirely on the Portuguese and what they were doing in the West Coast. He took the view that this was the darkest period of Indian history by far, that the Portuguese contributed virtually nothing to India. But what they did contribute was a culture of terror. That was his view. Okay. Yes, I mean, of course, I'm aware of the fact that some people will say that, oh, if you go to Goa, won't you see great churches? Which, of course, came about as a consequence of the fact that the Portuguese came there. The Portuguese were, of course, Catholics, right? And you do see, of course, church architecture in Goa and in a few other parts of the West Coast as well. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about, well, what did they contribute to the intellectual culture, to the moral culture of this country? Okay? And one of the arguments that has been advanced by people like Panikkar and also by Amitav Ghosh, that novelist whom I mentioned 5 minutes ago, is that what fundamentally changed was the following. All right, you don't have to accept the argument I'm going to give to you here. I just want you to think about the argument, that's all. The argument is that in the Indian Ocean trading world, all right, and go back again to the first slide here, right? This, when I talk about the Indian Ocean world, trading world, which was a trading world that existed for 1,000 years at least before the Europeans came to India, before the Portuguese came circa 1500. It included, the Indian Ocean trading world included all of this, all of Southeast Asia here, the South China Sea, so portions of China here, right, India, and what you don't see in this map, because it's not a map of the Indian Ocean trading network, if you go further west, Africa, the east coast of Africa, and the Middle East here, Aden, places like that. Now, this Indian Ocean trading network was a massive trading network. And Gujaratis, this is the part of India which is called Gujarat here, you see that right here. Gujaratis were extraordinary traders. You could go to any place here, any port here, and you would always run into a Gujarati. You would always run into a Gujarati. You know, as I sometimes put it in a very colloquial way, the Patel Brothers grocery store that you find in Cerritos or Artesia, it has a 1,500-year-old history, if I may put it this way. The Gujaratis traveled everywhere. Okay? They created a thalassocracy, a kind of a sea-born cultural empire, in a way. Now, in this trading world, there were certain norms that everyone adhered to. Let me be very clear. By this, I do not mean to say that the people who were taking part in this trade were saints. No, they were interested in profits, because that's what traders and shopkeepers and merchants are interested in. They're interested in making a livelihood and in generating profits. But there were limits that they accepted to what was limits to their profit making. What is the threshold? Because of course you could say that the essence of the modern corporation is the fact that there is no limit. There is no limit. Right? And so one of the things that was understood was that the ships that were plying, because if you're doing the trading, of course it's all happening, it's maritime trading. There's ships that are plying the sea routes. That the ships could not carry cannon. They could not carry heavy artillery. When the Portuguese came, they violated all these rules. In fact, when the Portuguese came to the west coast over here, okay, to Calicut over here, when Vasco da Gama came, if you read the accounts, you know, not only did he bring cannon on the ships, but he took hostages. Okay? And this is the sort of thing that K.M. Panikkar is talking about when he's talking about a culture of terror that was introduced by the Portuguese. that there was a kind of self-aggrandizement, a kind of greed, which really knew no limits at that point in time. Of course, there's also the theological question, because these people were zealots. They were zealots. The idea was that, you try to convert the infidel, the heathen, the barbarian, if you can. And there's a very interesting question, which I just posed for you right now. I'm not going to answer it. We're going to talk about it later on. But I think it's interesting that after 500 years of European history, India is one of the places that did not become predominantly Christian. It did not. Okay? Even though the English were there, the Portuguese were there, and Christianity, of course, has a presence in India which far predates the Portuguese, because Thomas landed here, exactly here, in the same place in the year 70 of the Common Era, almost 2,000 years ago. So we know that there's a Christian presence there in India that goes back to about 2,000 years. But what happened to the Portuguese was something that was very, very different. All right? So this is one part of the story that you need to keep in mind. Now the other part of the story you need to keep in mind is, what was the nature of political power in India, and what is the nature of political history in India before the coming of the British? It's not a vacuum, right? So what you have in India is what is called the Mughal Empire. Some of you may be familiar with it, the Mughal Empire. So it lasts for roughly around 200 years. In its heyday, the Mughal Empire, so that's during the period of Akbar the Great, who rules from 1556 to 1605. In its heyday, which is under Akbar, and then subsequently someone we're going to be looking at in greater detail, Aurangzeb, this empire was conceivably the richest empire in the world. Okay? And the comparisons that are usually going to be made are going to be made with the Ottomans, with the Safavids in Iran, right? Those are the comparisons that are very often made. There are people who teach who talk about what are called the gunpowder empires. So these are the empires they're really talking about. Okay, the Mughal Empire put into place a massive system of administration. One of the questions that we would be doing if we were doing a very advanced course is we would try to understand the extent to which the British, notwithstanding what they openly said about India, the extent to which they actually borrowed elements from Mughal administration into their own administration. Because again, I want to reiterate, I've used this phrase before, you have to remember that the British coming to India is not like the British coming to Australia. Okay? Which is not to say that Australia was a vacuum. That's how it's been represented. Oh, there was nobody there. It was just land. Yeah, there are some people who were known as the Aboriginals, right? No, in fact, the Aboriginals had, and it's not one group of Aboriginals. The Aboriginals of Arnhem Land are very different than the Aboriginals that you find on the east coast of Australia and what is today modern-day Sydney and Melbourne, let's say. Okay? But just for the sake of simplification, the European argument was that this is terra nullius. I don't know how many of you know this Latin phrase. A key phrase. Okay, terra nullius means empty land. Now, you know that you need a theory of that kind to justify your occupation. That if you say that it's empty land, there is nothing there, and under English common law, possession is 9/10 of the law. That is that if you simply go and occupy it, well, it becomes yours. The Europeans could not do that in India. You had the Mughals there. And just to give you a little idea of what were the kinds of stories that circulated about the Mughals, let me just read out a little passage. Okay, this is from John Kay's history called India History. And I'm deliberately using a Western source here. Okay, because if an Indian had written this, someone might say, well, that's an Indian nationalist, so they're going to pump up the glory of the Mughals. All right, so this is what he says. All foreign visitors to the India, page 326, all foreign visitors to the India of the six great Mughals Babur, Humayun, Akbar, there, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, found ample evidence of an awesome authority and were stunned by the magnificence of the imperial setting. This last was most obviously architectural. The Taj Mahal, for example, right? But not exclusively. The eye-catching profusion of solid gold and chased silver, precious silks and brocades, massive jewels, priceless carpets, and inlaid marbles was probably without parallel in history. Okay? I mean, the overwhelming idea of India was a land of fabled wealth. Now, whether it was actually grounded in reality or not is not what we're interested in. We're saying that this was the overwhelming impression that Europe had of India at this point in time, in 1600. Okay? Sir Thomas Roe, an emissary from James I of England, early 1600s, and a man usually more obsessed with his own dignity, was frankly amazed when he saw the Emperor Jahangir in ceremonial attire. The emperor's belt was of gold, his buckler and sword set all over with great diamonds and rubies, and then he continues and continues. And of course you could say, by the way, that you can read it in another way, because you could say this was the Oriental despot. You know, in the Orient, the king is everything, people are nothing. And all the wealth was accumulated by the despot. Right? That's the other way that you could read it, and subsequently they would read it this way. Subsequently, that's when Orientalism now becomes an operative mechanism for understanding the Orient. All right? So what are we saying? We're saying that, okay, on the one hand, if there are two elements that you have to think about when you're looking at, you know, the precursors to the British. One is that there is a European presence in India already. Okay? And I want to turn to another slide here for a moment, and then we'll come back to this. That one way to understand the history of British India immediately is to say that what we're really talking about is a European phase of Indian history. Right? Obviously, there have been political systems, there have been empires, kingdoms, right? But the coming of the Portuguese and then the other Europeans and then eventually the British marks the beginning of what you might call the European phase of Indian history. Secondly, the Portuguese, like the British, were a maritime power. They were a maritime power. They were a naval power. The Mughals had a navy too, by the way. Okay? And there have been kingdoms in India, rulers who presided over great navies. The best example would be the Cholas in South India, right? In the what is today the state of Tamil Nadu, deep south in India, in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, the Cholas. But by and large, it would be accurate to say that those who have dominated India have been land powers, not maritime powers. Before the coming of the Europeans. So with the coming of the Europeans, you enter into a new phase, partly because maritime power becomes fundamentally important. All right? And thirdly, what the coming of the Portuguese and then in turn the other Europeans, eventually leading to the British, signifies is the domination, obviously, of the East by the West, which is really a new phase of history that had not really been encountered anywhere before. Right? And it's going to essentially suggest the transfer of power and wealth from the East to the West. So there are going to be shifts, tectonic shifts in what you might call the world economy. Right? We're going to look at the nature of that. We're going to look at some data, some of which is disputed, of course, but there is no question in my mind, and in the mind of many historians who have written, that one way to characterize the significance of what's happening here is to suggest that there was going to be a transfer of power and wealth. And finally, just to give you that large framework, the fifth point, which was not going to be evident to anyone at all, and in fact K.M. Panikkar really doesn't talk about it either, neither does Edward Said, but I want to really highlight that. that one of the consequences of European colonization of India, of Africa, was the fact that these parts of the world, which had long been in conversation with each other, right? That is what the Indian Ocean Trading Network is about. It's not simply an economic network. What we are saying is that India was in a certain kind of conversation with Southeast Asia, with Africa, with Aden, with what you today call portions of the Middle East, the Gulf states, and that this was happening for centuries. And one of the consequences of European colonization was that even the memory of these links between different parts of the global south, even the memory of these is going to be wiped out. So that if you're an Indian today, you know what your worldview is. You know what the extent of the world is that you know. You know your country and you know something called the West. If you're a Chinese, you know something about your country, and then if you know anything else about the rest of the world, what do you know about? The West. And when we say the West, by the way, we mean mainly the United States today. I mean, 75 years ago it would have been different. It would have included London and Paris, and yes, I know that if you're North African, you're still likely to go to Paris rather than come to, let's say, Los Angeles. But I'm saying in general, right? And if you're an African, what is your worldview? If you're Nigerian, well, you know something about Nigeria, and then you know something about the West. You don't know anything about each other. Indians do not read Chinese and Nigerians and Ghanaians, and the Chinese do not read Indians and Japanese. No. If they read anybody else, it's always going to be a European writer, a Western writer. And this, I'm suggesting to you, was one of the consequences of this colonization, the European colonization. Right? So what I'm calling the evisceration of these South-South networks, which had gone on for hundreds of years. Yes?
I'm just confused why. Is it because they were too busy focusing on the colonizing power, or how did
because the West came to completely dominate their imagination. The way in which the US dominates the imagination of the world. If you think about it, when an American election takes place, I was in India when Obama got elected the first time around in 2008. There were people who were celebrating as though he had been elected president of India. Right? I mean, there were middle-class Indians who were much more excited about the election taking place here than they were about the election taking place in their own country. And I can tell you it's exactly the same everywhere. Think about it this way. September 11th bombings. What is the newspaper headline in the major French newspaper, Le Monde, the next day? You know what the headline was? We are all Americans. Now imagine that the World Trade Center had been in Somalia and it had been brought down. Do you think Le Monde would have said we are all Somalians? No. Because there is a way in which the US, in which America becomes everyone's. American history becomes everyone's history. It completely hogs the limelight. It dominates the imagination. You see, that's what I'm talking about. And this is what I'm saying was one of the most profound effects of colonialism. But this is an introductory framework, okay? Because what we're saying is that, look, let's try to understand what very broadly, before we get into the particulars of the British and how they came, that very broadly, these were some of the implications of the European phase of Indian history. Okay? Yes, Lorenzo.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
I think it's important. And aren't we, because you haven't mentioned it so far, I don't know, but don't you think would you say was there at all an important relationship with the other, between sort of this empire building in the Orient, which was mainly a British and French and also Dutch enterprise, and the great empire building of the Americas, the venerable Spanish Empire, the huge conquests of that area. Would you say that weren't the French and the British in some way copying what the Spanish and the Portuguese had done on the other side of the world in the Orient?
Look,
aren't those connected?
Yeah. They are and they're not. Because look, to try to understand what is the relationship between the conquest of the Americas, okay, the New World, right, and what was transpiring in the 18th century and the 19th century, I'm willing to entertain this, separately because it's a very large question. But I'll give you one illustration of where there is a continuity, and then an illustration of where there is not a continuity. Okay, that would be one way of answering the question. One way in which there is a continuity between the conquest of the Americas, what happened in North America and South America and Central America, what is today, how that's demarcated. The idea of terra nullius was used in all of these contexts. Okay? And of course, that is why you get the renaming of places, right? Because one of the things that happens under colonialism is that you arrogate to yourself the power to name.
Indians.
Right? Okay?
Indians in the New World.
Yeah. I'll give you a little anecdote. You might think, the anecdote has nothing to do with it, but it has everything to do with it. So when I was growing up in school in India, we used to have a course called GK, General Knowledge. Right? Basically, it entailed massive memorization. So you had to know the 10 tallest mountains in the world, the 10 longest rivers in the world. You had to know the capital of every country, because when you appeared for the exam the next day, you would get this: what is the capital of Peru? What is the capital of Colombia? Right? And you just had to know the answers to these. So, capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. So I raised my hand in class and I said to the teacher, "What does D.C. stand for?" And she said, "I don't know." And she said, "I don't know." Now, I'm talking about the 1970s here, 1970s. There's no internet, so you can't quickly go to Google and, okay, right? So she says, "I'll tell you tomorrow. I'm going to look into this. I'm going to try to find out." Because the fact of the matter is, if you check out all the almanacs, as they were called, now no one uses almanacs, okay, almanacs, and they would always say Washington, comma, D.C. They would never spell it out. They just didn't, because it was taken for granted that you knew, or that it didn't matter, either way, right? So she says, "I'll tell you tomorrow." Now, in the meantime, I go back home, and I'm, at the same time, I've got another class which is in world history, and at that very moment, we were learning about what was happening in the Americas. The discovery of America by Columbus, right? Now, discovery of America by Columbus, right? So the next day when I show up in class, she says, "Vinay, I've got the answer for you." I said, "What is it?" She says, "DC means District of Columbia." I said, "No, that's not the right answer. It's discovered by Columbus. That's the right answer." Okay? And of course, the preposition in either case is not part of the abbreviation here, right? The acronym here, right? So now you could say that technically she had the right answer, but politically I had the right answer, right? Okay? See, what we're saying is this. To go back to your question, okay? There is a continuity. The continuity has to do with notions of discovery, exploration, the idea of terra nullius. There's nothing there. Okay? In India, of course, you could not use the terra nullius doctrine in the same way. So you use the variation. What is the variation? Very important. Will come up again later on. The variation is, there are people there, there's land there, but it is not being put to good use. It's wasteland. It's not productive. That's how you get the idea of the lazy native. The lazy native. That Indians don't understand productivity. You see, it's the same concept with a variation. Because it gives you, terra nullius means It's actually almost a legal doctrine in a way. Empty land, nullis, nothing. Terra, land, there's nothing there. The Europeans come to the Americans and say, oh, there's nothing there. Because, yeah, they're these American Indians, but they're barbarians. They don't have a civilization. The land is ours for taking. In India, you use a variation, which is a softer variation. So, yes, there are continuities, but there are enormous differences. Because one of those differences has to do also with such things as extraction. That is that the Spanish model was based principally on the notion of extraction. Okay? Now you mine these countries, you extract the wealth. It's how you deal with the tribal world all over today. That's what corporations do. Because tribal lands almost all over the world happen to be lands which are enormously mineral rich. I mean, if you know the history of Myanmar or Burma, that's exactly what's going on there. That's why you have all this turmoil. And that's why all these corporations trying to go in. Because for them, it's just extraction. Extraction was not the only thing that signifies what the British and the French are doing. In fact, it was not even important in many ways, I would argue. Okay? So, to properly answer that, and then we would have to look at the role of knowledge. Were the Spanish attempting to create a body of knowledge? And you could say in some ways yes, because the first grammar written by Nebrija says that the grammar will be like a foot soldier. I mean, talk about knowledge doing the work of conquest. A grammar of the language will be like a foot soldier. It helps you in conquering. Right? But having said that, they do not create a body of knowledge in the way in which this body of knowledge became a central argument for British colonialism in India and subsequently in Africa. But there are lots of ways in which one could continue to parse, the similarities and the differences between what was happening with the European conquest of the Americas and what happened in places like India and Africa in the 18th and 19th century.
But they're independent, right? Sort of, they're two separate phenomena that sort of are connected. But
they're connected and they're different. They're different, yes, in many ways as well. All right? Now, this is the larger framework. Leave aside Orientalism. This is a different framework here where we are saying that before we get into this particular history, let's try to understand what is signified by the advent of the Europeans in India. Okay? And this is just a few points. I mean, one could obviously elaborate upon it, but this is what I think gives you the larger framework. So, now I've talked very briefly about the Portuguese. I want to turn my attention to the Mughals very briefly. Okay, I've already mentioned them to you before, but the Mughal Empire. So if you look at this particular map over here, you see that the Mughal Empire 1526 to 1707. Now the English will come into India in the first decade of the 1600s. So when the English first arrived in India, the Mughal Empire was an extraordinary political force. An extraordinary political force. Right? They're not stepping into, as I said, anything that you might call a vacuum. In fact, at that point, Akbar, added by Akbar 1605, Akbar is going to be succeeded by Jahangir. So in fact, when the company, and I'm going to get to the company in just a few minutes, what is the East India Company? The company is going to first interact not with Akbar, they're going to interact with Jahangir, his successor. Okay, and if you look at the bottom portion here, this is going to be added by a later Mughal emperor, the last of the great Mughal emperors, Aurangzeb. So this is going to be the Mughal Empire at its height. If you look at the boundaries here in yellow, all the way up till here, this is going to be the extent of the Mughal Empire. All right, and we're going to turn to sort of the economic aspects of it later on. But I want to make a few observations about the Mughals, because look, we have to anticipate some of the arguments that people are going to make. When they're going to say, all right, so the British were colonial rulers, but wasn't India colonized by the Mughals before? It was colonized by the English. Right? That's a question that someone is going to raise. What is it that makes the English different? And I think we have to make a number of observations here. The first is that the Mughals become, if I may put it this way, heavily Indianized. Okay? You know that if you look at the history of India over a very long span of time, there are clearly people who came as conquerors, and when they came as conquerors, they came simply to loot and pillage. Now, you plunder the land. You plunder the land, you take the wealth, and you go back. Right? I mean, so the classic example of that is a man called Muhammad of Ghazni, right, who comes into India, you know, reportedly 20 times at least. You know, he's coming from west of India, is coming from today Afghanistan, Central Asia, that part. So he's coming into India again because, you know, you plunder the land, right? And then you go back. No intention of staying there, no intention of creating an empire, if I may put it this way. And I think it's important to understand this politics of conquest. I want to dwell on this example for a minute. Again, because I want you to think about its implications as we move along. So this person I'm talking about, Muhammad of Ghazni, all right? So let's say circa, the invasions of India began about 980 and go on till about, let's say, roughly 1010. Okay, by him. He comes into India and then takes the loot. Now, Muhammad of Ghazni attacked Hindu temples. Okay, now, and if you read Hindu nationalist historians, and not just Hindu nationalist historians, if I talk to a middle-class Hindu person in India, let's say members of my extended family, okay, I mean, if I want them to get into a rage, absolute rage, all I have to do is mention this bloke's name, Muhammad of Ghazni, because he is the best example from their point of view of the barbaric Muslim who comes to India, hates Hinduism, loots the country, plunders the country, destroys the idols, reduces the temples to rubble, so forth and so on. Right? I mean, his name, you just Google it, it'll just, people, they just get into a rage when they listen to his name. Now, I don't have any brief on behalf of him. Let me be very clear. Okay? I have no intention of defending him even remotely. But what I do want to say is this, that it is a mistake to suppose that he had any kind of special animosity towards the Hindus, simply because he happened to destroy Hindu temples. By the way, he also destroyed all the mosques that were Shia mosques, because he was an Orthodox Sunni. Right? So he is what I call an equal opportunity employer. Okay? I mean, if you do not represent the faith in his idea of the form of the faith, you're an infidel or a heretic. And I also would argue that had there been a State Bank of India in the year 980, he would have gone straight there. He wouldn't have gone to the temple. The reason he went to the temple is because that's where wealth was hoarded. That's where wealth was hoarded. All he's really doing is he is exemplifying what we can call the politics of conquest. That's what conquerors do. Right? If there had been a Bank of America, he would have made a dive for it. I can guarantee that. He has no special, as I said, animosity in a way about Hinduism. Now, this is all very important. Why? Because the Mughal Empire, when all is said and done, and yes, there is a big difference between Akbar and Aurangzeb. So, you know, if I may use modern language, Akbar is very often represented as the good Muslim, and Aurangzeb is the bad Muslim, right? Because Akbar was an example of tolerance, pluralism. So, you know, there are edicts that are issued in his reign where he says that people of all faiths are welcome. And actually in his court he invited people who were Hindus. He married Hindu women, by the way. Even though he was a Muslim ruler, he married Hindu women as well. All right? and he would invite people who were Christians, who were Jews, to his court for dialogues, for conversations. Aurangzeb is very often represented as someone who was a fanatic Muslim. Fanatic Muslim. But again, it's very controversial. Very last year, by the way, if you think this is all remote history, last year Aurangzeb Road, which is a major road in the capital city of India, New Delhi, was renamed. Right? So he was a bad Muslim. They had to put in another Muslim's name on that road, so they put in the good Muslim now. Right? See how contemporary discourse, you've heard this, good Muslim, bad Muslim, it's all over the place. It gets reworked into these things all the time. But the Mughal Empire, notwithstanding the differences that there might have been between different rulers, and there were, was all said and done, at the end of the day, I would say, an example of considerable pluralism, ecumenism, and tolerance. Okay? And that's very important, because the British, when they step foot into India, what is the history of Britain? What is the history of Europe up till that point in time? It is largely a history of religious warfare. The Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Crusades, okay? The long-standing animosities in the three Abrahamic faiths. I want to put it in those terms. I know that one can, find wiggle room here and there. There are nuances one can put in, but let's just put it boldly. I'm suggesting to you that when the Europeans came to India, they came from a background where religious conflict had been their history. They therefore assumed, this is now a different way to understand Orientalism, they therefore assumed that their history would tell them something about the history of how religions had interacted with each other in India. They assumed that because their conflicts, religious conflicts, had dominated their imagination, therefore, India was a country where religious conflict had been the norm. That is what they assumed. And yet another way, maybe the 10th way now by this time, of understanding Orientalism, when you use the templates of your own history to try to understand someone else's history. So when the Europeans come to India, they encounter the Mughal emperor. They're encountering an empire which really was outside their vision. Frankly, I'm going to put it in such stark terms. This was an empire that was extraordinarily complex. It was complex for other reasons, which are quite obvious the minute I mention them, such as the linguistic diversity, the religious diversity, for example. Right? But it was also complex because there were conflicts and disagreements. I'm not saying there were never conflicts and disagreements. That would be absurd. But there were ways in which they had been negotiated over a period of time. All right? This is what the Europeans are stepping foot inside. So you have an empire which has an extraordinarily elaborate administrative structure. And that administrative structure is used not just for governance, it's used for such things as revenue, collection of revenue. Because no empire can exist without, obviously, revenue collection. Right? And the Mughals certainly needed. In fact, it has been argued, and I'm quite sympathetic with that argument, that one of the reasons why the Mughal Empire eventually collapsed had to do with the fact that the demands for revenue were extraordinary. They were extraordinary partially because, for example, because of these massive architectural works. If for those of you who've been to India or if you've just seen a few images, and I'm not talking just about the Taj Mahal, which is the most well-known, but the whole city of Shah Jahanabad, Old Delhi, and these were massive works of architecture, okay? The whole city built by Akbar Fatehpur Sikri. This required enormous revenue. Also, when you are trying to maintain an empire of this kind, you need an extraordinarily large military apparatus. Because the problem always with all of these empires of this size, how do you control the extremities? So here is your capital here, Delhi, Agra, Lahore. These are the major cities here where the Mughals are based. If there's a rebellion that breaks out by disaffected people in this area, it's relatively easy to put it down. But if a rebellion breaks out right over here, in the extremity of your empire, it's much more difficult. And in fact, Emperor Aurangzeb, he spent 30 years of his life fighting military campaigns way down here in the Deccan. Down in the Deccan. And in those days, you know, when the Mughal emperor's army went down south, you know what it meant? 500,000 soldiers, minimum. And thousands of cooks. Nobody thinks of that. Who's going to feed these people? 5,000 elephants. Tens of thousands of horses. I mean, it's a whole city that is moving. When the emperor goes to war down here, all of this placed extraordinary demands on the empire's revenue-keeping operations. Right? That's what we're really talking about. So we're talking about an empire that had elaborate systems of governance, okay, elaborate systems of revenue extraction, an empire that at the same time was ecumenical, pluralistic, where yes, there was animosity between, quote, Hindus and Muslims. I want to put that in quotation marks, because nobody in 1600 would describe herself or himself as a Hindu. No person described himself or herself as a Hindu at that time. This is a much later way of describing these people. Okay? So we'll have to understand what we mean when we use these terms. Okay? And I'm giving you just a few features of this, and it's a land power for the most part. A land power for the most part. Right? This is the context that you need to keep in mind. Now, the company, just a few elementary words. I'm going to get into the history beginning next lecture. But I want you to think about a corporation. The East India Company was the beginning of the modern corporation. If you're thinking about Walmart, okay, the interesting thing is that in London, which is a city that is steeped in heritage, I mean, every single thing is commemorated. You know, this is where Dickens ate, this is where Florence Nightingale did that. There are thousands of statues. The company is not remembered at all. Its very site, Leadenhall and Lime Streets, the intersection, there isn't even a plaque. Forget about the building that stood there, which housed the company's headquarters, which was wiped out years ago. There isn't even a plaque there. Okay? That's very important. And I'm saying, and that's in a city that prides itself on heritage. You know, in a country that has a national heritage trust where they've got thousands, tens of thousands of buildings, you know, under the jurisdiction of the National Heritage Trust. Right? And I'm saying to you, think about the modern day corporation. Okay? Is the company a kind of an antecedent to the modern day corporation? Right? So with those thoughts, I'm going to leave you, and in my next lecture, I'm going to launch straight into the founding of the company and the company's early work in India before the conquest.